Tak, to byly dvě dámy, které jsme si vyposlechli. Ty si teď obě dvě, jak jsem už naznačila, sednou tady k tomu velkému stolu a připojí se k ním další osazenstvo. Představí ho Petr Koupský, analytik, publicista a konzultant v oblasti informačních technologií, který bude moderátorem tohoto prvního velkého panelu, který je nazván Otevřená data pro odpovědnost. Takže Petře, já vám přeju dobrý den a je to vaše.
Dobrý den, a to jsou na nějakou dobu poslední slova, která tady pronesu česky. Good morning, everybody. What are we going to have now is the first discussion panel of our conference. Most of the members of the panel you have seen before in their presentations, but I can't see the rest of them. Yeah. You have seen Sue, you have seen Eva, you have seen Andrew, and who's joining us now is Pavel Černý. Pavel is lawyer with experience from NGO as well as governmental services. He served his term in the Legislation Council of the Czech government, which can be very useful for our discussion panel now. What are we going to discuss? As we have heard before, UK is perhaps the first and foremost country in the world when it comes to open data. I have to emphasize that it's great honor for us to have people here who achieved it personally, who made it possible in the UK, and it's a great source of inspiration for us. On the other hand, Czech Republic apparently falls behind in the field of open data. One of the main purposes of this panel is to discuss why is it so and how to improve the situation. As we have heard, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, was vital for the success of open data in the UK. Unfortunately, we can't expect in our country for the foreseeable future our own leader who will stay behind such a development. Our politicians, as we all know, have a lot of other pressuring problems to solve. So my question to our British guests and to everybody as well is how to improve our situation in this less friendly environment. Please give us some advice.
The presentation that Eva gave was interesting in highlighting to me some of the difficulties that I don't think I'd fully appreciated around the intention and then the lack of progress. I guess one of the things that we do always cite in the UK is around having this senior political leadership. Certainly the Prime Minister is there, but then down to the next level as a senior minister who is a sponsor for this and has been since he came into office under the coalition government. So Francis Mard, who I think was on the video as well this morning. He is very passionate about this because he sees the linkages through to the other parts of the agenda that he's responsible for. Two of the big things of those are around civil service reform and within that efficiency and reform. So in other words, how do we improve the way that the civil service operates, looking at skills of people that are needed for a future civil service, as well as looking at where efficiencies can be made and looking at public procurement. So the open data and transparency kind of underpins those bits of the agenda. So one suggestion might be, is there, if not at the most senior leadership level politically, is there a minister who is willing to champion this because of the other benefits that it could give and the absolutely clear for us linkages into the other bits of the agenda? And then I guess the other thing is around having buy-in from the civil service as well, and having a group of people such as the Transparency Board in our case, who are recognised as knowing about this, recognised experts who can then help to shape the agenda. But underpinning that, you need to do a lot of groundwork with departments and beyond. Actually, it's engaging externally, getting those people who want to see reform to help you actually, as through their lobbying and activism, to make changes happen.
I agree very much with what Sue has said. I think that it would be wrong to see the UK as this being an example where the Prime Minister has just decided to do this.
I haven't said it at all.
And so it's a sort of it's the strong the strong leader model has risks as well as advantages. I think in the UK, and it started with the previous Prime Minister of a different party, and who had been interested in the use of digital techniques to get citizen engagement. And then two things happened. Firstly, he had the famous lunch with Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the man who invented the World Wide Web of documents. And Tim's theme of the year was the web of data. So Tim just pitched data. And I remember Richard coming to me after this lunch, and we had a note from the Prime Minister's office saying the Prime Minister has been, Sir Tim Berners-Lee has been talking to the Prime Minister about open data. The Prime Minister doesn't know what this is. What do you think could be done in the next 6 months, and how would we use Tim Berners-Lee to help with that? And so Richard and I wrote the case for what became data.gov.uk. But the thing that pushed it over into reality in the UK was the parliamentary expenses scandal and the feeling by the Prime Minister and the government at the time that the same forces that had exposed information about parliamentary, about MPs' expenses, that was being kept secret, would turn their attention on the government, and the government would lose control of the agenda. And as a result, the Prime Minister made a number of announcements in the following weeks about more transparent government, including, as it happened, open data, which was part of that wider movement. And I think we see that those political pressures coming up in various forms in all sorts of jurisdictions. As I said, that citizens no longer just trusting the government and wanting to be, the government to be more transparent and to understand what the government is doing on things where the government can be transparent. I think also, and this is a really big issue whenever I talk to ministers of health, both in the UK and in other countries, is that increasingly politicians, ministers, are held to blame for things that they can't really control. And the thing is, the thing if you're the Minister of Health or the Minister of Education, or even the Minister responsible for policing, is that it's not you who do the treating of the patients or the teaching of the children or the catching of the criminals. that's done by a very large professional, often quite sort of internally focused group of professionals, often on a networked, delegated basis through long delivery chains. But when something goes wrong, it's the minister's fault. Now that, in some ways, that's part of the job. But the thing that's interested Minister of Health in another country I talked to, and certainly interested UK Minister of Health, is getting citizens and patients to put upward pressure on their local service provider, on their local doctor, on their local hospital, to improve standards. And that can be done by giving information about how local performance compares. Indeed, sometimes just about what local services are supposed to be, what the government is funding. And then that creates an upward pressure for improvement on doctors who are seeing the patients all the time, on hospitals, so patients are saying, well, why am I coming to this hospital where there are lots of red rings on the chart when I could be going to the hospital in the other direction? And actually, if all local services improve, then the national average improves and the minister improves. In Uganda, there's a well-documented case when there was actually done a control group of giving some villages data about what the health services were supposed to be, and giving a little sponsorship to civic engagement and activism about that, having discussions in the village about that. And as a result, when the district nurse next turned up, the villagers were saying, well, hang on, weren't you supposed to be here last week? Isn't that what the government is paying you to do? Aren't you supposed to be giving our children all these immunisations? And in Uganda, in the controlled village, controlled villages, absenteeism by medical staff fell considerably. And importantly, the infant mortality, deaths of children under 5, dropped by 30%. Basically because the parents knew what service they were supposed to be getting and demanded it. So there's that. The politicians have definitely been interested and self-interested in harnessing the power of the crowd through information to put pressure on delivery chains. And one of the ways that we got the Ministry of the Interior, the Home Office in the UK, interested in this was actually by, rather than, we couldn't persuade them to open their data to start with, so we brought in some developers to use their data within the Home Office and just show what could be done. And the officials and the ministers just saw how exciting that was for the sorts of policies that they wanted to promote. So there are all sorts of things where can actually be a self-interest in politicians on this, and often in the UK, it's seen to be a pretty united political front against a pretty united bureaucratic front. That open data has not exposed great political scandals in the UK. It has certainly exposed a lot of cases like GoApe, where individual officials have been spending money in ways that was hard to justify. Since we started to publish expenses for senior civil servants, the amount claimed has gone down by 40%. And interestingly, that was even before the first newspaper stories analysing the data. And it's that if you know that your expenses are going to be could be scrutinised, you will think twice against taking a taxi when the bus or the metro will be equally good. So it's that sort of effect of changing behaviour. And as Sue said, I think Francis Maud certainly sees this as part of the efficiency agenda to get better value from from the money the taxpayer provides by getting a more questioning culture. Some of the benefits of transparency you get actually if no one actually looks at the data.
Yeah.
It's the thought that they might actually look at it that gets the change in behaviour.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for your input. I think that self-interesting of politicians in open data is something to remember from this conference very well. Pavel, may I ask you now, how is, from your experience, from, let's say, both sides, how is government able to cooperate with NGOs in open data? Is there any common denominator which can be used?
Thank you for your question. I don't want to avoid it at all, and I hope to come to it. But if I may say in the beginning, firstly, that my experience with this topic comes from the fact that that our firm became responsible for doing the evaluation report for the action plan of Open Governance Partnership for the Czech Republic, which was already mentioned here in the presentation of Ms. Kyzourová. And we came to the conclusions which were already also mentioned here, that there are ambitious commitments in the action plans, which, however, mostly all of them are not fully met at the time which was supposed in the action plan. And what I would like to say, and I would like to come to your question, is that if we compare our situation, for example, with Great Britain, then of course we have to be aware about the fact that, let's say, 20-25 years ago, the society was in a completely different situation than the British society, where there was uninterrupted development of the democracy and civil society. And it's clear that there has to be some choosing between the topics which were given the preference both by the government and the civil society. And in the area of transparency of the government, there are two closely related, but in my opinion different topics: access to information as such, concerning the content of the information which the public authorities have and which the society is demanding, and the form in which it is provided. And this is the open data in the narrow sense, I would say, that the form, the data or the information can be used and reused by the recipients. And I think that it's quite logical that in the situation of the, let's say, developing democracy, developing civil sector, in the beginning, the importance or the most important thing was the content. And I think the situation in the area of open data now is quite similar with the situation with respect to the right of access to information around the year 2000, when the first Czech Access to Information Act came into force. And there are bigger experts on the topic, the author of the act himself, Mr. Kužílek. And I think he would agree with me that despite still existing problems in the area of access to information, the situation now is completely different than in the year 2000. It's completely normal for the vast majority or great part of the society use this act to ask for the very different kinds of information, and most of them are provided more or less in accordance with the law. And it seemed, and it was also what Mr. Mraček said at his presentation, that now at the area of the open data in this narrower sense, in the form how it is provided for possible reusing them, now it's both on the side of the offices or government agencies and on the civil society. The people on both sides are still learning how to use this instrument for better results of the work. So my personal experience is that the society both the government and the civil society is still defining what the open data in the Czech context should mean and how it can be put into practice of their activities.
You've made an interesting point about discontinuity in the history of Czech society in comparison with Western Europe. Do you think are we still allowed to blame the past? It's 25 years now. It's a long time.
No, I don't want to say at all that it should be an excuse for the government, for the responsible societies. I just wanted to point out the fact that simply not every task can be achieved at the same moment. Yeah. And really, I see the relationship between, or the continuity between promoting the right for access to information as such, which logically came first, in my opinion, and not being perfect at all now is a normal part of the society, like in every I would say, average democratic country in the world. And I think at the area of open data, the similar way is in front of us, or most of it is in front of us.
Besides politicians, it is, from my point of view, it's necessary as well to sell the idea of open data to general public, which may or may not be interested in such a concept. For instance, the Czech society is totally disgusted with corruption. Eva, is it possible that anti-corruption activities which you are involved in, is it possible that they would be the driving factor for selling the open data to general public?
Yes, definitely. The transparency is the basic issue in connection with fight against corruption. It would be much more easier to do our work if our government is transparent enough.
By now, you in the audience have had no opportunity to ask your own questions to our morning speakers. So it's your turn now. Oh, the first question, yes.
Oh. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jirka Skuhrovec. I'm head of small NGO which tries to work with data which are not really so open. I would like to pose a question to the guest from UK regarding economies of scale in opening the data set. You know, when you talk about data on traffic in London, obviously it's much more easier to see why are there so many people interested in developing applications and so on. We could possibly get similar interest, say, regarding traffic information in Prague, but not so likely in, say, a bit of smaller cities. So my question is, even regarding the statewide data set, couldn't you see that there are sort of economies of scale which might sort of prevent our country from getting wider benefits from making some of the data sets available? Thank you.
I think there's to some extent there's a scale issue because of how the number of people who can get the benefit of that. Against that, there were, in some ways, in London, for instance, already routes to get some of that information. So Transport for London already had their own mobile application, and we're very proud of it. But very few people were doing that because you weren't getting the innovation through. So the gap, the potential gap for exploiting was smaller than having nothing at all. Secondly, a lot of the technologies and the understanding of using open data are now much better understood, and many of them are open, so they're easy to use. I advise a European Commission-funded project on the use of open data in transport on a cross-European basis, looking at a number of different cities: Manchester, Athens, Ghent, EC, but we've got about 30 other cities now interested and associated with that project, using some common approaches which reduces the cost of that and gives a toolkit, an SDK, software development kit, and a number of other tools that people can build innovative applications, including, in one case recently, a 9-year-old schoolboy built an application using the data, using the tools, which makes you feel very old. And some of that benefit is about the particular market, and it's a non-rivalrous benefit. So doing something that benefits the citizens of Prague gives benefit to the citizens of Prague, and because all the research shows that benefits are typically much larger than the costs, you can go down to a much lower level than would otherwise be the case.
I would agree with what Andrew said, and maybe just add a few reflections of my own. So yes, I can imagine that in terms of the size of population and where it's spread across the Czech Republic, that might seem, well, how can we do something comparable to the UK? When we look at what other countries around the world are doing in the open data space, countries like New Zealand, who have a much smaller population, are doing a lot with their open data. So in some cases, you know, the scale and comparing to, think about where you're comparing the opportunities to. And I was struck yesterday as we were looking around Prague and on the Charles Bridge, the sheer amount of tourists here, even in March, compared to other cities in Europe. You know, there might be opportunities to think about not just your own population within the Czech Republic, but the number of visitors coming here as well who could benefit from that open data. So I was in Iceland a few weeks ago on holiday, and one of the things that we specifically went there for was to see the Northern Lights. And you know, how do you find out when the Northern Lights are coming? Well, the Icelandic Met Office, so the weather service, have developed an app, so we knew where the opportunities were to see the Northern Lights, and as tourists that was something really valuable to us. So that's just a personal experience. And then Richard from the Commission may touch on this as well. Think about the Czech Republic in its position in Europe as well. As Andrew said, you know, there is work ongoing that isn't just isolated to countries. One of the things that we did last year within the G8 was develop an open data charter, and all of the G8 members, including the Commission themselves, have signed up to implementing the principles of the charter and releasing data under certain data sets. Once that has been achieved over the next couple of years, that in itself lends a number of possibilities to anybody globally wanting to take that data and compare and do things with it that we as kind of geeks and policy officials sitting around a table negotiating maybe couldn't have envisaged. So think about the connections and think about the unique position that you have as a country as well.
Okay. Another question, please. Yeah. Petr Kuchař.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Petr Kuchař. I am 23 years entrepreneur in IT technologies in the Czech Republic. We in Abra Software, we decided to give in a disposition of Otakar Motel Fund our toolsys for publishing data in a sector of open world of data. I'd like to ask our guests from United Kingdom which tools is used there for the publishing and how they get good data formats for the standardization of one of the government agencies, because I guess it's a crucial problem. Thank you.
So it's a rather technical question, but we are not afraid, are we?
We've, in the UK, at the national level, we've based data.gov.uk, the data portal, on CKAN, the Comprehensive Knowledge Archive Network, developed by the Open Knowledge Foundation, which is open source software. At the time, we very nearly didn't even have our own version of CKAN. We very nearly used the Open Knowledge Foundation's sort of global repository, but there are a number of reasons why we decided to just use that software and have our own site. That we made some enhancements to that software and have shared those back with CKAN as open source. That package is now pretty widely used around the world by governments. I think it's by far the leading package. It's certainly the most leading open source package. In terms of the formats, to start with, although we said we would prefer linked data formats and we prefer open formats rather than proprietary formats, we wanted to minimize the cost and the burden on agencies publishing data. So we basically said, if it's in a recognized reusable format, publish it as that. We did some work on having some early linked data examples like legislation.gov.uk, which John will talk about, and a lot of the education data was in a very well structured database that we could publish as linked data from the start. The government's commitment now is to move up what's known as the 5-star scale of open data towards, at a minimum, using an open format rather than a proprietary format of that data, and to make further progress of using linked data, semantic web techniques. Depending on how the data is stored in the agency that holds it, there may be a number of techniques of getting that out. What we've always said is that the extraction of the data and the decision on what data actually is extracted and published must be one for the data owner. It's not one for Sue and her colleagues now to take. And the act of publishing the data on data.gov.uk is actually done by the agency responsible, which is why we avoid having a large central team or a central bureaucracy. Individual departments and agencies can publish their data. There are problems of standardization, particularly where there are the same sorts of data. The expenditure data published by central government agencies every month is supposed to be in an absolutely standard format, mandated by the Ministry of Finance, which is very, very, very specific. And yet when I look at these data sets, and I've recently done an exercise looking at these, no two agencies keep to exactly the same specification in terms of which fields are there, what the fields are called, which order they're in, whether currency signs are used or not, how the organizational structure is represented. And we have some automated tools that help with the enforcement of this, including, our agencies continuing every month to publish the data they're supposed to be publishing. And there's an automated scorecard that's actually done by the Open Knowledge Foundation on the UK government's behalf. The first time that was released, and it highlighted those departments that had failed to publish data that they were supposed to publish by the Prime Minister's instruction. There were the most check-ins of new data in a week on data.gov.uk than there had ever been before, as people sort of caught up. So people behave as they're measured. But this standardization issue is a deeper malaise of the use of data within governments, that people don't think about the reuse of data. They don't think about the real applications of standards. It's like everything. Everyone thinks the standards are great except when they apply to them. And it goes down the line. We had, one of the instructions was save. It's quite easy to publish a spreadsheet. You just save it as a CSV file. We found some data that had been published with a file which ended .csv, but actually had been stored in the Microsoft Excel proprietary format, because people had thought, I just need to change the name. I don't need to change the drop-down box where it says what format you want to say it in. And this is a continuing issue. I mean, Eleanor Stewart will talk about the FCO this afternoon. We recently had FCO recently had a hackathon in which someone actually looked at FCO open data sets. And one of the things is that we don't actually have a standard for naming countries. So different databases name the countries in different ways. So that's not only a problem when you try and combine, other people try and combine the open data. Somehow that's a problem within the ministry itself. And one of the things that's happened with open data is actually opening the data creates a pressure to improve the quality of that data upstream. People often say to me, well, perhaps we should delay publishing our data until we improve the quality. The evidence is that if you don't publish the data, the quality doesn't improve. Once you start to publish the data, then suddenly the quality issue is much more visible. And the people who've always wanted to improve the quality suddenly have stronger arguments and more evidence that they can use to get the investment and the business process changes needed to improve that quality.
Do you wish to add something?
I'm not sure that there is much I can add to that.
There is another question from Mr. Kužílek.
Jednak se omluvím, že se zeptám česky, protože bych to některé specifikace nedovedl úplně přesně. A taky, že možná trošku shrnu, protože musím pak brzy odejít, tak mě nezbývá než trošku něco uvést i jako informaci. Skutečně ten zákon o přístupu k informacím od začátku byl koncipován jako spojené nádoby mezi poskytováním na žádosti a aktivním poskytováním od úřadu, ale tato logika byla dlouhodobě pak potlačována a judikatura se tomu tolik nevěnovala. Ten současný stav toho zákona v podstatě je takový, že on obsahuje možnost vynutit si vyžadovat otevřená data, dokonce až i otevřená data, čímž myslím i strukturu a metadata k tomu, která umožní použít tu strukturu. V každém případě ten vývoj judikatury třeba v kauze toho brněnského podniku CHAPS se vydal trošku nešťastným směrem. Uvidíme, jak se to vyvine. Je zde ale na stole novelizace evropské směrnice a to jsem vlastně chtěl říci, že mám tedy připravenou tu implementaci poměrně kompletně a včetně toho, že je možné určitým způsobem vytvořit druhý tlak, než o kterém se tady takticky mluví. To znamená tlak šéfů, ministrů, těch našich Cameronů do veřejné správy, ale vytvořit vedle toho tlak žadatelů, kteří by měli právní nástroj a pokud by požádali o určitý dataset, o kterém vědí, tak by ho museli právní cestou dostat v kvalitní open datácké podobě s metadaty a se strukturou. Takhle je to připravené, ta novelizace péčí senátora Michálka, teda se mnou, tak to sděluju, protože na to dojde. A druhá věc, doufám, že se podaří i ten taktický tlak vyvíjet. Mám přislíbeno blízkou spolupráci s ministrem vnitra i s novou náměstkyní ministra vnitra pro tuto oblast. Říkám to tady vlastně trošku sebemrskačsky, protože se můžu dostat do bůh ví jakých situací, ale zase to říkám, protože tady je velké volání, abychom s tím nějak hnuli, tak mě nezbývá, než to trošku přiznat takhle a doufám, že bychom touto cestou mohli také něco posouvat. Ale to je asi všechno, já bych nechtěl to zneužít, ale položím tedy otázku. Jestli si myslí přátelé z Británie, že ten tlak těch žadatelů, pokud budou mít právní nástroj, je dostatečně kompatibilní a jak ho doplňovat s tím tlakem, řekl bych, osvícených vládců, v tom případě, kdyby nebyli osvícení vládci a bylo to jenom na té veřejnosti. Děkuji.
So, shall I start? I think that's a very interesting question. Sorry, I can hear so, if I've understood correctly, is the legislation that will come into place by 2015 around the PSI reuse directive enough of a lever to make things happen, and will having that in place alone be a means for applicants to get data? My feeling would be not. In the UK, we have Freedom of Information Act, where it's a similar situation where applicants can request information. Generally, we put things through an interest test for the public, and I'm not sure of the statistics, maybe Andrew has those to hand, around the percentage of which is released versus that which is considered for commercial security or reasons of advice exclusively to ministers that can't be released. But to me, particularly in the field of work that we're doing in our team, that piece of legislation feels like a bit of a backstop, really, in terms of an attitude and an approach. So I think it's there certainly as a mechanism to try and get to data that isn't proactively being released, but I think you also need a mechanism where government is being more proactive and has a policy around the release of data which it considers to be open and in the interests of both government and citizens. So I think you need both. I think just having the legislation alone, it will not change the behaviour that you need to make for truly open data.
I'd very much agree with Sue on that. I think certainly in the UK, the Freedom of Information legislation in some ways was intended to achieve some of the proactive openness that we're now seeing with open data. But that was never really implemented, and it has become a very adversarial system. It's been, and the FOI process, which ultimately is a legal process, turns out not to be very effective or disproportionately ineffective at extracting data from agencies. And the reasons are various. One of them is about cost. So most Freedom of Information Acts, and I think the Czech one has this provision, the UK one certainly has, is that above a certain level, if the requester wants the information, then they have to pay the cost of it, or the government can refuse it. So it's a disproportionate cost argument. And often extracting the data is more costly than taking a copy of a single document.
And who is to pay?
Sorry?
And who is to pay?
And the requester would then have to pay. And what's more, we have some evidence where the same freedom of information request has been made of multiple authorities, that the costs claimed can be very different. And sometimes that is pure exaggeration, but how do you know, and how would you explain that? Sometimes it's because they've entered into extremely poor contracts with IT suppliers that mean a request for data is a bit of new work, which is where the suppliers make their profit. It's like a request for change. The second issue, which in the end we solved by changing the Freedom of Information Act in the UK, was that Freedom of Information Acts normally give a right to access to information, but they don't give, and this is the case in Germany, and this is the case with the original law in the UK, they don't give a right to use that information. So it's quite common, it was quite common in the UK to see this information is supplied to you only for the purposes of private and personal study. You can't publish it, you can't use it commercially or anything like that. And not always a lot of enforcement of that. But certainly for economic uses of data, you don't want to have any sort of legal risk about how you're using the data. The third issue is barrier to entry. That by the time you have fought your way through the freedom of information process and several levels of appeal, even if you manage to get hold of the data, you've probably forgotten why you asked for it in the first place. We find that quite a lot of innovative uses of the data, of open data, come by people downloading the data sort of interest and exploring it and understanding it, and then having an idea how it can be used. So if you don't know what's there, you may not actually make the request, or you may not pursue the request. So the bureaucratic process of FOI is a barrier. The fourth element is repeatability. That if you succeed in getting some data by the Freedom of Information Act this month, next month, some other decision maker may take a different decision. And so if you've built your business on getting information by the Freedom of Information Act, what happens if the arguments have changed and suddenly you find you can't get the data through the Freedom of Information Act? Which is why we look to, when data is published openly, for the government to give not a commitment of necessarily to publish it forever, because the idea is that the government should only have the data if it had to collect it in the first place, but a reasonable expectation that access will continue and that data will be updated at appropriate regular intervals. And the final, the two other elements about FOI. The first is that the FOI, the Freedom of Information Acts, allow data to be withheld that nevertheless governments may want to publish. So Sue mentioned the COINS database, which is the Finance Ministry's central database of budgets and spending by the UK government. That had previously been requested under the Freedom of Information Act and refused on 6 separate grounds, all of which were used to justify the refusal of the entire database. And the new government came in with a political commitment to publish this data. Now, all of those 6 grounds had some justification in them about some of the data in there. So I was told to work with the Ministry of Finance to actually work out how we could publish most of the data. And we did, and we were open about the things that we'd cut out. So anyone wanting to know the detailed spending of the intelligence agencies, sorry, we cut it out of the data. Spending on current military operations, we'd cut out of data, some experimental things we'd cut out of the data. So, you know, if you look at the data as is, it may be right to refuse it. But if you have an open data policy, then you may be looking, then you should look to what can you publish in there, which may mean, you know, you don't publish everything because there are good reasons to withhold that. And the final reason, I think this goes to, takes us back to the revised directive on the reuse of public sector information, is that certainly under the UK Freedom of Information Act, you can't get hold of data, government data, that you can buy from the government. If you ask for data that you can buy, you're just told go off and buy it. And the thing that the new directive has done has been to introduce, for the first time, some limits on what those charges for data can be. That they should just be about the cost of, marginal cost of distribution, which often if you put it on the website, that's effectively zero, certainly too cheap to try and collect a payment for, and that, you know, selling information shouldn't be a backdoor way, or, you know, shouldn't be a backdoor taxation of the government trying to generate more revenue. And in the UK, we've got some historic issues where a few agencies have been funded on the basis of selling information, and we're working through freeing up that data piece by piece.
So not everything is so bright and easygoing, even in the UK. Oldřich Kužílek again.
Přátelé, toto by bylo fatální nedorozumění. Asi jsem to řekl špatně. Ten návrh, zopakuju, že to bylo fatální nedorozumění, že jsem to asi neřekl přesně. Ten návrh má na mysli, že každý si může vyžádat to opakované poskytování a v rámci žádosti říci, poskytujte mi jednou týdně přírůstkové soubory, nebo zřiďte FTP přístup, nebo dejte na web tyto datasety, já si je pak už jako každý jiný budu stahovat, tam je pak samozřejmě to bezplatné. A samozřejmě také to má upravit tu licenční volnost, že je to rovnou poskytováno s licencí pro v podstatě téměř jakékoliv použití. Čili omlouvám se, že jsem to asi nepřesně teda zavedl na ten jakoby rozpor mezi na žádost a aktivně, který se někdy děje, ale tady ten pokus bude, aby se to přiblížilo. Osvícený úředník bude zveřejňovat aktivně a kvalitně, k čemu sám dospěje, ale vedle toho může osvícený podnikatel, pan kuchař třeba, říci, já vím, že oni tam mají tady ten dataset, oni ho ještě nezveřejňují a já podám takto tu žádost a bude se muset nastartovat ten proces, kde odmítnutí by muselo být pouze seriózně odůvodněno. Tak jestli jsem to takhle upřesnil, protože to bych jinak odcházel z této konference v domnění, že jsem způsobil nějaké úplné nedorozumění.
Chápu-li to správně, to není dotaz.
No tím pádem dotaz zůstává v tom poměru mezi aktivitou osvíceného úředníka a tlakem zájmu zpracovávatelů. A nastavit kombinaci těchto dvou prvků. Tak jak vidí to, jak se to bude doplňovat?
And who?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I can.
Neither me.
Right. I think what just a number of points on the UK. The first is, yes, there is the FOI process, but we also have on data.gov.uk a way of requesting data without the formal process. And one of the things about going through that route is that the central transparency team are aware of the request and can have the conversation within government. The second is that the most successful reuses of data have generally involved the agency that owns the data and the users of that data being in contact. The data owning agency explaining the data, giving access to people who know about that data, helping the use of that data, and positively encouraging that, both by working with individual developers and by having competitions, and often through that you get a way of also the users feeding back, well, you're putting the data in this form, but it would really be more useful to us if you did it in this way. You've put out this data, but it's very hard to understand because it refers to this other data, which you don't publish. So could you please publish, the codes, your coding schemes for where you put things in, supply codes or location codes, or the like. And in some cases, the data owner and the users cooperating to improve the quality of the data. So we released data on 300,000 bus stops in the UK. And OpenStreetMap, the Wikipedia of maps, came to us and said, well, this bus stop data is incredibly useful and we're trying to put it on OpenStreetMap. But some of the bus stops are clearly not right. There are bus stops in the middle of lakes. So we had a project with OpenStreetMap and their volunteers to verify this bus stop data, so it was more accurate on OpenStreetMap. 18,000 bus stops needed to be adjusted. Sometimes it was because the geocoding was simply wrong. Sometimes it was because they were on the wrong side of the street, or some other factor. And then those changes to the data were taken back into government itself. So government had a more accurate record of the bus stops. So very much the data owner and the data user working together.
Thanks. Additional comment from Pavel?
Just a brief comment from the experience from preparing the report to the Open Government Partnership Action Plan. Actually, when we talked to different people on the topic of the open data, there were two basic approaches which I think very much relate to the previous discussion. Some people said if the current laws are interpreted progressively, either the freedom of information or copyright laws and so on, we don't need any other new legislative framework. We just need a combination of the pressure from the public and progressive interpretation of the agencies, and this is the way how the standards of the publishing data in open formats can be increased considerably. And the other approach was it's necessary there is explicit legislation which would give a duty for the government agencies to provide data in some formats, because they will not do it if they are not explicitly told that they have this duty. And I think it's really, as was said in the beginning of the discussion, that our conclusion was that the combination of the two approaches is needed, because if there is not an explicit legal regulation, there will always be like positive deviations, as it was already presented, that some either municipalities, cities, or some agencies will do that, but it would never become a common situation or common standard when the laws are not explicit on that. I completely agree with Mr. Kužílek that the Freedom of Information Act in the current stage allows the requester to ask for a specific format of the information, and when there is no reason the information should be provided in this format, but it's still I think needed that it's said explicitly in the law that the data should be published in this format actively.
Okay. We are running out of our time, so perhaps the last two questions. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Sam Kuchera, and I'm from the University of Economics Prague. And I would like to ask you, because you showed some really interesting return on investment numbers for your cases. Do you have in place some common cost-benefit model in your transparency agenda by which you assess the activities that you plan to do? Thank you.
I don't think I would go as far to say that we have a cost benefits plan, but certainly one of the things that we are focusing on that Andrew mentioned in his presentation up front is around the idea of that the UK has progressively released more data from the 1,000 data sets back years ago up to having over 10,000 available now, and then through a survey over the summer a realisation that we have potentially 4,000 more data sets, and kind of sitting over that is, so well, where are the most valuable data sets within that potential 14,000 and I guess growing number of data sets that we hold, which is the idea behind the National Information Infrastructure, where we want to identify those data sets in an inventory that have the most value for us, and by us I mean not only the government but for citizens as well. So one of the things that we're working through is to look at and try and identify which of those data sets, which will probably be a much smaller number than even the 1,000 published originally, that are the highest priority for us, and that I guess is where we will start to look then at the cost benefit and impact of those particular data sets rather than trying to do everything across the 14,000.
I think that's true, but I think I should also emphasise that the UK's policy is open by default. So it is not up to the requester of the data to prove that there is benefit of that. And the UK, the general policy is that data should be released unless there is a good reason why it should not be released. The open data policy as a whole has an economic basis, and that's playing out in practice. Similarly, the revised PSI directive has an economic basis, and the Commission commissioned lots of research and evidence to back that up. But at the level of individual data set, it's not for individual officials to say, well, I don't think there's enough benefit from publishing that. Where we are tending to use value, as Sue was alluding to, is in data sets that would incur disproportionate costs in releasing. We want to prioritise the spending of additional money to cases which give the greatest benefit. And that certainly applies to cases where at the moment there are charges for data. And removing those charges, we obviously want to remove the charges soonest in the areas where that would give the most benefit. So, yes, there is some cost-benefit analysis in some cases, but it's a fine-tuning of a policy that is basically open by default.
And now the last one. Sure.
Can I just make a final point, since this is the last time? People will be glad to hear that this is the last time they will hear from me today, unless I ask a question later, which is the point about history that was raised earlier. The UK has a history too, and
we all know.
And one of the policy objections to open data at the start was that we had established mechanisms of scrutiny of budgets by Parliament, and of audit of state audit bodies, And they were doing a pretty good job, it was said. So why, and citizens should just trust them to get on with it rather than do them themselves. And indeed, some of the objection to open data came precisely from some members of parliament and particularly the audit bodies, who saw their magic and their privileged access to data being reduced when it was available to others. So, in a sense, being transparent to the citizens rather than being transparent to other people on behalf of the citizens was a change from the historical model in the UK as well. And there's been a significant cultural change, and not without people pushing back against that change.
Thanks a lot for your final comment. Now let me say thanks to our members of the panel, Sue Bateman, Eva Kizourová, Pavel Černý, and Andrew Stott. And that's it for morning part of our conference. Lunch is prepared, as far as I know. Use the time of the lunch not only for relax, but for networking and socializing as well. But relax, because the afternoon part is very interesting.
Je to tak, uvidíme se ve 13 hodin, kdy začne ta odpolední část. Dobrou chuť.